Thanks, Theo, and thanks to the team running this festival symposium. I remember when I think Theo was conceptualizing Bode Electrons, we probably had about 2 weeks back and forth about should it be a festival or should it be a symposium. And I'm delighted that so many years later we haven't settled on either. So that's really wonderful. And then I also just want to, on behalf of Rhodes University, send our condolences to the UCT College of Music for the sad loss of Carl Smith this weekend. It's a major loss to the South African music scene as a whole, and our thoughts are with you as a department, as a fraternity, as a family in this very difficult time. But onto, I guess, slightly different matter. So the Bode Electrons Festival Symposium, because I couldn't pick one, is now in its 6th year, a remarkable achievement driven by Theo Harps. It is perhaps the richest gathering of its type in the country, and for me personally, one of the most interesting in the world. And I don't say that lightly. I've been to quite a few, and this is where it's at. It's not possible to discern a single focus or agenda that cuts across all the previous 5 symposium and 5.5, including this one. Although one could say that perhaps a driving curiosity around sound underpins much of what has been presented. Yet in my address today, I want to focus on a theme that for me has emerged almost by way of implication, almost as a specter in many of the presentations and performances of past events. And this is a specter of the archive. Those of you who attended the first symposium in 2018 will remember Luca Fukuchi's unsettling use of film archive recordings of dances in his composition Bodyscape. While later at the same event, I spoke about the memory work of Theo's own Konka Klanka Tunguska. At the 2019 meeting, the theme of archive was perhaps the most explicit in Neo Muyanga's keynote address on Miriam Makeba's archival recordings. Yet a number of papers touched on similar themes. Pakama Nkunes spoke about the tape reels in the Hidden Years music archive. And we heard Simon Emerson speak about his memory machine and mnemonics. And this was also a theme in his own keynote address, in which he recounted much of his own archive of creativity. This is also where we first encountered Anne Graff's remarkable Book of Coincidences, which was a striking palimpsest of material traces of the past. We also heard at the symposium Cara Stacey's Untoward, which I theorized elsewhere as an activation of the decolonial archive. I was not able to attend much of the 2020 symposium, but in 2021 and 22, the archival ghost was still present. In my keynote address in 2021, I spoke about the various agencies of indigenous music technology, which emerged from collaborative work in one of the world's largest African music sound archives, the International Library of African Music at Rhodes University. And indeed, what I wrote in that paper, and as I'll explain shortly, set me on a path to the argument I will make today. But we also heard at this event about another palimpsest in Jonathan Crossley and Cameron Harris's iterative compositional work. In 2022, we heard recollections of Dizo Plaiki's journey with his musical bow, while Chris Lowe told us about the environmental archives of the San. This year, we've heard a number of intriguing papers on similar themes. Denise Unen's work taps into an archive of media through sampling, while Linda Kuchler's research directly addressed the need to recalibrate the sensorial in the archive. Of course, my survey here is not exhaustive, but I hope it shows that in our discussions about sound at Bode Electrons, the spectre of the archive, or at least the spectre of sound's relationship to the past, has never been far away. It lurks, sometimes anxiously, sometimes delightfully, in the background of our thought and practice. While the spectre of the archive has been haunting many of our discussions, my own work has been interested in other forms of uncanny agency. In my 2021 keynote address, I spoke about the ways in which we might reframe the agentive forces at play at the intersection of indigenous music and technology. I theorize in this paper forms of agency exerted by technological actants, such as the Uhadi and Umkhube, and even by water. To illustrate what I called aesthetic technological agency, I turned to Theo's Umkhalavas Tivaleni Vatmak Yai, which he wrote for the 2010 Bow Music album. Here, he composed with archival field recordings of Marcin Nguni bow player Nofunish Divili, who passed away in 2002, and to whom the Bow Music album was dedicated. The work's form, I showed, is determined by a set of focal tones with dense spectra, which are drawn from Divili's striking of the Uhadi, that act as anchoring points between which material is distributed. These focal tones act as structural markers in the piece and in turn can be understood as affective in the agentive sense of the word. Thinking beyond only the structural agency enacted in Divili's bow strokes, her voice and song I showed consume the string quartet at the start of the work. Her voice and her Uhadi were thus, in a sensorial, aesthetic sense, central actants in the work's soundscape. And this sense of aesthetic agency is enabled, of course, by not only the recording and playback technologies used in sampling her music in the piece, which we might identify as type of collaborative technological agents here, but also act within the work as aesthetic technologies too. Indeed, because Divili was no longer alive at the time of making the work, the sense of collaboration is transformed here through interpretation, through the act of responding to her agency, into a form of aesthetic technological agency. In retrospect, I assumed much around the materiality of sound in making this argument. For instance, if in the compositional process sound becomes an object, as Pierre Schaeffer and many other theorists of the acousmatic would argue, then surely it does not exert agency. Instead, sound is simply put to use or mobilized by Haps and many other composers in the compositional act. Why was I assigning the field recordings of Divili some sort of agency when they were simply artifacts from the archive that could be manipulated and formed by the composer? Was I inadvertently reanimating her for what Jason Staniak and Benjamin Pickett called a form of intermundane labor or a duet with the dead? Should her voice and Uhadi not simply remain things or traces that can be stitched into a sonic collage? These questions shook the foundations of my argument, just as they have shaken many similar arguments that draw on notions of distributed agency across networks of human and non-human actants. Faced with this critique, I returned to Umkhalavasativaleni, the opening of which we've just heard, to help me think through this problem. I listened again and again, but could not bring myself to agree with the idea that this work is simply a collection of sound objects. There is something more at work here. Sound is doing something. Its materiality is suggestive of something more than simply a kind of pseudo-solid object. Thinking with Habs's composition, I want to, in my paper today, to think through sound's materiality, and especially think about what this materiality means for the spectre of the archive, which has been so present in our discussions. Of course, there are many ways to conceive of the relationship between sound's materiality and the archive, and indeed each artist who has presented their work at Bode Electrons has dealt with the issue in different ways. But given that we are focusing here on the notion of sound, and given that we are largely doing so through poiesis, I want to consider what sound's materiality might suggest about its historical and possibly aesthetic relationship to the archive. In doing so, I want to draw on the help of two examples. The first will be Habs's Umhalavasati Valeni, which I will disperse throughout this paper as a type of oral marker to ward off the objectification critique I mentioned before, and it will function as a kind of playlist for sound thinking. Secondly, and as a slightly more straightforward example, to root my argument around sound's materiality in the archive, I will consider Noel Lobley's sound elicitation experiment, which he conducted during his fieldwork for his PhD in 2008. For this experiment, Lobley embarked on a process of taking recordings stored in the International Library of African Music's Hugh Tracy collection out to the musicians, artists, and community members in the townships of Makanda. Among these was a recording of the song Somagwaza, captured by Tracy in 1957 in the Lusikisiki district. The notes accompanying the recording assert that it was a praise song sung by men and women in, quote, thanks to the chief when he killed a beast for them, end quote. However, in taking this recording out of the archive and introducing it into the everyday musical settings within Xhosa communities, varied historical interpretations emerged. For some, the song was known as part of initiation rites, sung when boys returned as men from the bush. For another, it was a song used in healing ceremonies. One interlocutor grabbed an electric guitar and improvised over the song's melody, while others wrestled with tears of nostalgia in their responses. As Lobley recounts, and I quote, many people gave detailed memories and stories to demonstrate what they described as the correct version of the song, explaining where and when it was appropriate to sing the song and who in particular could sing it, end quote. Almost none of the listeners, however, accepted Tracy's original description. So Lobley's experiment interests me because it seems to offer a powerful critique of the colonial sound archive, which stems, as I will argue, from a reconception of sound's materiality. What I find most striking in Lobley's work is how the Somagwaza recording effectively stands as an impoverished trace inside the archive that only becomes historically meaningful once sounded out beyond its archival arrest. This process of charging a recording with meaning illustrates for me the paradox of sound's relationship to the colonial sound archive, which is caught between a presentist notion of sound's becoming and the historical draw to the ways in which sound leaves an imprint. Sound, Lobley's experiment seems to suggest, can only exist in the present, but the meanings we assign to it are always coded by its traces in the past. So in this paper, I think through this paradox to show that perhaps sound can never be historically useful if it is relegated as an object to the archive of things, but that rather it is the affective and physical traces, the markings left by sound's sounding, that make possible the historiographical condition of the sound archive. In other words, the historical possibility of sound is occasioned by sound's anti-archival action, which is, as I will argue, a product of its vibrational materiality, its generative affordances, and its intermaterial impressions left in the past. make this argument, I want to start by shifting the focus in debates around sound's materiality by considering Tim Ingold's critique of theories of materiality more broadly. For this critique, Ingold argues that when we use the term materiality, we often invoke a type of duplicity. In a singular instance, he shows materiality suggests, and I quote, the raw physicality of the world's material character and the agency of humans who project onto the physicality of the world design and meaning, end quote. When we say materiality, in other words, we mean two things at once. We mean the stuff, the matter of the world, and the force by which we as people turn matter into things. What concerns Ingold here is not so much the dubious logic of this duplicity, but rather a problematic underlying proposition which has to do with solidity. Whether describing the bedrock of existence or the arrested external comprehension of this matter, theories of materiality seem to suggest that the, quote, material world has by nature such properties of obduracy and consistency of shape as to define the state of the world as a solid, end quote, and that's from Ingold as well. A bedrock of existence stops matter slipping through our ontologically needy fingers, just as an arresting comprehension gives us some sense of epistemological surety. However, in invoking material states of fixity, the possibility of what Ingold calls a becoming of materials, to which we actually appeal through the notion of materiality, falls, and I quote, through the cracks of an already solidified world, end quote. This same sense of entrapment in solidity is common in descriptions of sound, right? Take, for example, Steve Goodman's important early contribution to the discourse of sound and war. In developing what he calls an ontology of vibrational force, Goodman must start by asserting that, and I quote, sound is merely vibrations audible to humans and animals, end quote. I like the animals, but the rest not so much. Sound here is cast into the solid notion of vibration. But in the very same sentence, it also becomes its own fixed exteriority through which it is comprehended. If sound is thought of as vibrations, that is, the noun form as object, then the possibility of its becoming, which is appealed to in the notion of materiality, is lost. And Goodman is not an exception in this case. Jonathan Stern also argues that, and I quote, sounds are defined as that class of vibrations perceived by a functioning ear when they travel through a medium that can convey changes in pressures, such as air, end quote. Though slightly more suggestive of a state of becoming, perhaps, we have here a triple objectification in vibration, perception, and medium. So as much as both Stern and Goodman fall into the trap of solidification identified by Ingold, their definitions of sound are not incorrect. And I don't think anybody here would think they are incorrect, nor unhelpful when thinking through, for instance, the material cultures and histories of sound. Yet I want to venture, along with Ingold, that this is a less helpful way of understanding sound's possible historical entanglements. Indeed, Ingold's critique of materiality asks us to think beyond this form of objectification. For Ingold, when thinking of materiality beyond a sense of objectification, we need to differentiate between two fairly dominant ways in which people have dealt with the issue of matter. The first is that of the chemist, and I don't mean to swipe here at Dimitri, who's a chemist actually. This is the more abstract chemist, I guess. Chemists, as Ingold shows, are concerned with reducing the matter of the world to a set of molecular relationships. They think of substances as various combinations of elements. So rust, for instance, is for the chemist the result of the reaction that occurs when iron and oxygen atoms interact. It is simply a resultant state of this reaction, nothing more and nothing less. Ingold, however, argues that this is a mode of thinking that results in the solidification of matter as indexical substance, which through diagnosis we can taxonomize. In other words, to think of matter like a chemist is to think of what matter is. Not bad, but not great either. The other dealer in matter is the alchemist. The alchemist does not seek to reduce the matter of the world to a taxonomy of elements, but rather considers its material possibilities. Rust is not simply the molecular combination of iron and oxygen, but it is rather the coloring red or brown, the action of abrasion, the absence of combustibility, or the instability needed for the base of a new alloy. In other words, for the alchemist, and I quote Ingold here, material, rust in this case, is not known by what it is, but by what it does, end quote. Materiality in the sense of focusing on what materials do draws us away from a world already solidified to one caught up in one of sound's most vexing domains, namely time. As Ingold argues, and I quote, materials do not exist in the manner of objects, as static entities with diagnostic attributes. Rather, as substances in becoming, they carry on or perdure, forever overtaking the formal destinations that at one time or another have been assigned to them, and undergoing continual modulation as they do so, end quote. In turning to this sense of materiality, we need not abandon authors such as Goodman and Stern entirely. Indeed, the vibrational sense of sound has been useful in what Raymond Aron has called the disillusion of the object. Thought of as vibration, sound is made utilitarian in a way that music, with all its transcendental cultural baggage, can never be. This is particularly evident in Nina Eitzheim's work on the sensory engagement with sound and, once properly dismantled, music. While largely concerned with issues of voice, Eitzheim shows how 19th century European aesthetic thought around the abstraction of music has resulted in an a priori, quote, figuration of sound, quote, as an object external to the bodies which create it. However, she contends, this abstract figuration does little to explain the intermaterial sensory experience of sound, which extend beyond only the oral and which seem to envelop the perceiver through its atmospheric and corporeal transduction. In accounting for the ways in which sound might be extended beyond the oral into the realms of the haptic or even visual, she develops the notion of sound as a, quote, practice of vibration, end quote, which resolutely resists the type of solidification or objectification which Ingold has critiqued in theories of materiality. So as Eitzheim argues, we, and I quote her at some length here, simultaneously create and experience vibration, sound, and music in the same moment, both as performers and as listeners. And it is precisely because vibrations do not exist separately from the materiality of the human body that we cannot objectify them, end quote. There is, in other words, no bedrock nor exteriority in this framework. The solidity of sound is made liquid, fleeing, or even leaky, and thereby refocuses our attention on what it does rather than what it is. Eitzheim indeed identifies through her notion of a practice of vibration the sense of doing which is so important in Ingold's notion of materiality. It is worth quoting her at some length on this point again. If sound and music have been reduced to static nouns in 19th century theories of abstraction, she argues, then, quote, the practice of vibration is a verb, regenerating its energy through material transmission and transduction within a continuous field. In other words, in applying the intermaterial vibrational framework, we turn our focus away from the effect and force of a stable object towards the unfolding intermaterial process, end quote. Intermaterial because when thought of as verb or action of doing, sound's materiality becomes as important as the perceiver's material body, but it is not solidified through its matter or purpose. Instead, sound becomes a material which consistently flees or leaks out of its static figuration. Eitzheim's conception of sound as vibrational practice is helpful in thinking more carefully about sound's materiality. Yet it does pose a certain problem when considering sound's relationship to historiography. If sound is always a fleeing object or a substance in becoming, then its materiality would seem to be consigned only to the present. Indeed, this is quite a common idea in discussions of sound's ontology. In his work on orality and literacy, for instance, Walter Ong has argued that, and I quote, sound exists only when it's going out of existence, end quote. While flirting with the idea of the historical abyss, Ong's use of the present participle, going, to occasion the present continuous verb tense is important here. Sound is going. It engenders a forever present and is impossible as an object of the past tense. Sound which does not sound in the present, Ong seems to suggest, does not exist. Ong thus presents us with something of an ontological crisis, which luckily Ingold seems to be able to respond to. Ingold's critique does not only require a shift to the verb action of materiality, he also asks us to consider how these materials, as he puts it, perdure or remain beyond their assigned functions. The sense of remaining here is different to Ong's continuous evocation of the present. As Ingold argues, to know a material is to know its stories. When we consider what material does, we also consider what it has done. But how do we reconcile this with the hard truth that sound physically does not exist beyond its moment of sounding? This, Ingold would remind us, and I'd say perhaps as well, is the wrong question, which only betrays our discomfort with thinking beyond the objectification of sound. More usefully, we might ask what sound as verb action leaves in its wake. I turn to Paul Ricoeur in trying to think through this question of what sound leaves in its wake. In speaking about what he calls the historiographical operation, Ricoeur describes three forms of traces, which are the basic units of the complex interplay of memory, history, and forgetting. Traces are the impressions or inscriptions left by things in the past, which act as the vessels that, broadly speaking, transport the past into the present. They can be organized into three types: the physical trace, the affective trace, and the cortical trace. The cortical trace refers to the neurological impressions in the brain, and largely are embedded in the physiology or the physiological mechanisms of recall. And I won't be chatting much about that, don't worry. Physical traces take the form of external markings of the past, the concrete inscriptions through which the past is accessed. These are the traces that, in the traditional sense, make up the archives and are things, the letters, the diaries, inventories, photographic film, or even wax cylinders, grappled with by everyday, perhaps Weetabix-eating historians. Finally, the most problematic for Ricoeur, the affective trace, or inscription affections, as he sometimes refers to them. And these emerge as the lingering residue of striking or marking events. They are not external markings in the sense that their matter can be indexed. Rather, they are the impressions created by experiences. Against writing and discourse, these are for Ricoeur the impressions left in wax, the impressions that are ever embroiled in forgetting, but whose alignment with truth substantiates judgment. As Ricoeur writes, and I quote, "These inscription affections would contain the secret of the enigma of the mnemonic trace. They would be the repository of the most hidden but most original meaning of the verb to remain, synonym of to endure," end quote. Indeed, what allows for the affective trace to remain is the very possibility of its effacement. It is a trace that is made legible after it slips away from memory and is brought back through a process of recognition. I don't want to suggest that sound is like the inscription affection, but rather that sound in the archive must be thought of as suspended between the physical trace and the affective trace. Sound marks, even if it doesn't touch in the sense of two material bodies meeting. Suzanne Cusack's work on music and torture has been especially powerful in articulating this. Speaking about methods of no-touch torture developed by the CIA along with Canadian and British intelligence agencies after the Second World War, she has shown how sound was utilized in a modern system of torture predicated upon self-inflicted harm, which leave no marks on the body. Of course, in the resultant induced regression and schizophrenia, the markings are all too apparent. But sound marks in other ways, and this can be seen in the realm of the physical trace, in the ridged grooves of the shellac or the etchings on the phonograph record. I don't want to dwell too long on Ricoeur's work, but the proposition that I want to make for navigating sound's complicated materiality within the archive is that it is thought in relation to these affective and physical traces. With that, we can return to Lobley's experiment. In terms of its materiality, what does the sound of the Somagwaza song do when it confronts listeners outside of the archive? Lobley suggests that it does largely two things. First, it affords a process of recognition. The various listeners recognize the song either from the initiation processions they themselves have been part of, or from hearing it in their township surroundings. This process of recognition asserts the sound's historical past. That is, it invokes a sense that this song remains beyond its initial recording in the Lusikisiki district by being drawn into the present from a latent reserve of affective traces. Secondly, the song affords historical interpretation. It is the differing interpretations that interest Lobley, which through recognition return to the present through the articulation of something of the stories of the sound, and more specifically, what the sound has done for certain people at certain times. Yes, these interpretations seem to compete for some kind of claim to truth, but they also seem malleable in their presentation. Listeners ask Lobley first, and I quote, "What do you know about this song?" End quote, before fashioning their own interpretation. This is almost as if the listener first asks, what has this song done in the past, before proceeding to provide an alternative possibility of its verb action. Recognition and interpretation are perhaps indicative of the affective trace being put to work. Yet if that is so, then it is only because the physical trace in the archive, or even series of physical traces from the magnetic tape to shellac record to digital MP3 storage, has been taken out of the archive to enable sound's reproduction and its ultimate recognition. Yet in conceiving of Lobley's experiment in these terms, a radical proposition presents itself. Perhaps there is no such thing as a sound archive. Perhaps what we call the sound archive is actually an archive of sound's traces, both affective and physical. Thought of as verb action, sound seems to negate the archive or even present something of an anti-archive. If the archive is first an archiving of things, as Ricoeur reminds us, then perhaps sound occupies a liminal space posited only by the imprinting of affective traces outside of the archive and physical traces within the archive. If this is so, however, sound seems to push against the thingification of the archive. At best, it seems to flee to the margins of the archive, always seeking to leak out. Yet if sound flees in this way, then it is not inconceivable to think that sound has some form of agency, right? Indeed, thinking about the verb action of sound, as Ingold asks us to do, suggests that sound does in the same way as any actor in a network does. A critique of sound's materiality then not only explains why sound is uncomfortably placed in the colonial archive, but also becomes the theoretical grounds for considering the types of agencies I have assigned to it in my 2021 keynote address. In this sense, considering the Davili recordings simply as sound objects is to negate their materiality and relegate them to an already solidified world. It is to treat her sounds much like the chemist might, stripping them down to some kind of molecular taxonomy. Habs's piece, however, rejects this approach and rather treats sound like the alchemists would. Yes, sound is perhaps molecular in this work, but more importantly, sound is recast in terms of its verb action, its ability to imprint, its resolutely vibrating agency. To think sound's materiality in Umkhalavas Tivaleni, in other words, is to recognize its agency, its material possibility, and its stories. Could you play the last slide?
feel this is holy ground. I'm too afraid to approach. Last time I walked very quickly and I was looking. William, you give me wings without telling me. Yeah, so I suppose it's not common for keynote speakers to be forced to answer questions.
But I'll gladly field questions if there are any. If everybody's feeling like it's just been a long day, then we can go and have a glass of wine instead.
But question number one is pray continue with our view. Yeah. So firstly, in all seriousness, William, thank you. The work you're doing is stellar. It is simply magnificent. The grace, the sensitivity with which you approach a complex society, our Southern African musical cauldron, the manner in which you manage to expose shortcomings, the manner in which you help us craft a future is something very, very special. By a personality, a musicologist of a quality that I have not encountered in my life. Thank you for that. I'm taking you up on your offer of wine, tea, coffee. So let's break and pop over to the cafeteria and have something to drink.
Thank you.